Today we are going to be talking about this. This is a bass trumpet. This particular example has rotary valves, which are these things here. Pushing this lever, it twists a rotor, which is located 1, 2 and 3, and that invokes these extra additional piece of tubing to be added to the loop that is this instrument. That is instead of the more traditional valve, which is a piston. The advantages to having rotors over pistons is that it alters your intonation. It makes your intonation sound just that little bit different. The other benefit is that you don't have to move your fingers as much. Piston valves like this have an action of just under 2 centimeters, whereas rotors like this have an action of about 1 centimeter. You don't have to move your fingers as far. But whereas the experience of pushing a valve piston is the same regardless of where your finger is placed, that is not true with the rotor. Because the rotor operates as a lever, if you push it here you get much less resistance than what you would experience if you push it up near the central pivot point. Now, in my opinion, these instruments are largely worthless. And I say that because there traditionally hasn't been much repertoire that calls for the services of a bass trumpet. There still isn't. There are other much more prevalent instruments that take the place that this trumpet is trying to squeeze into. Instruments such as the valve trombone sound almost identical to this valve trumpet. If we start off with looking at this whole instrument, we can see that it is indeed a member of the trumpet family. The furthermost component to this end of the instrument is the mouthpiece, and the furthermost component at this end is the bell. Now that fits in with the definition of a trumpet that I describe in a video that I'll link to below, and also will be available by clicking in this general region. And it also fits the other criteria of a trumpet, that it is cylindrical tubing. It starts at one diameter here, about 0.45 of an inch, and that diameter stays, and the diameter of this tubing stays consistent all throughout the interstices of this instrument, and only starts to change when you get to the final stretch of the instrument as it proceeds around this angle and out through the bell section. They are really the two characteristics that I've talked about previously that define this as being a trumpet. However, if we ignore the form factor of this, if we ignore the fact that it is shaped as a trumpet, it is identical to a valve trombone. The amount of tubing, the quantity, the length of the tubing is exactly the same as in a valve trombone. And there is really no defining difference between them other than their appearance. And that appearance does not manifest itself in any tonal changes on the instrument. So I'm not really fond of these. They don't really serve a point. They might find a place if you were in a trumpet orchestra or as a part of a trumpet line where you only had trumpets and you needed a bass sound. Perhaps they might find a place there, but in standard bands, there's no need for them. Now, this instrument doesn't play particularly well in the low range. It is certainly much better suited to the higher ranges. And if I try to play something low, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to play a slurred passage out of Herbert Clarke's arrangement of the Carnival of Venice, and I'm going to play it on this instrument here, which has the rotary valves, and I'm also going to play the same phrase on an instrument with piston valves. Now, I don't have a valve trombone on me. Personally, I don't think they're worthy of being called a trombone. I think a valve trombone is an excuse. But I do have another piston valved instrument that speaks in the same pitch, and that is this rather battered Bach forward-facing bell baritone that I was given some time ago. It has 3 piston valves that work reasonably well despite the rather average condition of this instrument. And I'm going to play the same phrase on this and on the bass trumpet, largely to demonstrate the difference between the types of valves. This next example will demonstrate the differences between having a cylindrical tubing, such as what you find with trumpets, and a more conical tubing, such as what you will find with that baritone and euphoniums and tubas and things of that ilk. That demonstration starts off quietly, gets louder, and finally ends up in a raucous, crass blast. If we do the same exercise on an instrument with conical tubing, and remember conical tubing starts off small and grows throughout the length of the instrument until it ends with a much larger bell flare. That same example sounds like this. Whilst the trumpet sound fundamentally changes as your dynamics increase, with instruments that have a conical bore it is much difficult to get that crass, cracking sound that you can quite easily get with a cylindrical bored instrument. Instead, this instrument merely gets louder. There is some change to the timbre of the sound, but it isn't as marked as what you'd get with a trumpet. Now, some aspects of this instrument itself. Because you're holding it straight against your chops, it is a very front-heavy instrument. That's a downside compared to the valve trombone, because the valve trombone is based on the shape of a normal trombone, which means you have part of it hangs over your neck to act as some sort of counterweight. That means your shoulder and your left hand come very much into part of balancing that instrument in a more convenient fashion. This particular example can only be held by your right hand with your thumb, which sits in an undefined place on the bottom tube here, and there is no little finger ring, which means you can't use your little finger to support the weight of the instrument at all. As for your left hand, well, there is no defined place on this instrument to hold it. It can simply go wherever you like. But because this instrument has double the amount of tubing as a trumpet, and extends further away from you than what you would get with a regular trumpet, it is a lot more inclined to make your limbs tired after a shorter period of use. The reason why I don't feel comfortable advertising this as a proper trumpet is because it misses a lot of the qualities, the tonal qualities that make up the trumpet family. Sure, it has the same shape, it has some of the physical characteristics in common with this instrument, but the brassiness of the sound, the pointed direct tone that the trumpet possesses, is not something that you get out of one of these. The trumpet is very much direct and to the point. This feels like you're playing with cotton wool stuff down the instrument, and I think the sound matches that. Finally, I'm going to attempt to play the final variation of Clarke's Carnival of Venice. I expect this to show the limitations of the valves of this instrument quite strongly, the limitations of me as a player also strongly, and also when it skips to some of the low notes, the difficulty that I have in trying to articulate those notes on this particular instrument. Thanks very much for watching this review and demonstration of the B-flat bass trumpet. Please remember to subscribe, like and share this video. Thanks for watching.